it. So, Steve, over to you. Steve is going to give us a talk now,
Okay.
looking at republicanism from a social and democrat point of view.
Just very briefly, comrades, I'm just going to try to cover. This was my plan for the talk, which was about democratic and social republic. And that little phrase at the beginning, "Long live the universal and social republic," was something that 3 of the communards from the Paris Commune shouted out as they were executed. It was the last thing that they sort of said. So when I saw that, I thought it was quite a poignant thing to take hold of. So what I want to talk about, go over these points: Ben's Republic, the Democratic and Social Republic, monarchical, presidential and democratic republics, centralized and federal, secular ones. But I think we've had such a good discussion on that. I'm going to skip over point 5 because I think we've collectively done a very good thing on that, and I don't need to go over that. What the term social means, and then just come back to Tony Benn. So that's my quick tour around the points I want to try to cover in this talk. So the first one is the reference here to Tony Benn's Commonwealth of Britain bill. We've taken that in the Left Labour Alliance and the Republican Labour Group as a kind of marker, because in a way that is the highest point, I believe, achieved from within the Labour tradition. And if we are a Left Labour Alliance, we're not necessarily a Marxist alliance, we're a Left Labour Alliance. And I think that what Tony Benn did and what he wrote about and his analysis is something that we have to take very, very seriously. It's a terrible shame that nobody on the left has taken this bill up. And I think it will probably fall to us. I hope it will fall to us to actually advance from what he was talking about. We don't have to completely agree with what he was talking about or even be uncritical of it, by the way. I'm not saying that it's like this is the gospel according to, Tony Benn or anything like that. And so I'm going to do like a slightly critical angle on it, taking more things from the 19th century, things that Marx talked about and things like that, but not to destroy this idea, simply to illustrate it, to get hopefully a better knowledge. But he proposed that Britain become a democratic, federal and secular Commonwealth of Britain. That is the phrase that he has at the beginning of his bill. So in a way, you can see why I chose those questions. They all jump out as that's exactly what this is that we had to get around, i.e. a republic with a written constitution. And he had a very extensive bill. It's difficult I'd love to get hold of that bill and circulate it around so people could read all it's like a whole constitution for the country. And whether we can find it and share it around, I don't know. But anyway, those key points: democratic, federal, a secular Commonwealth of Britain. That's what he starts with. So my next point was to say, just to draw out those 4 points to illustrate what I'm going to talk about the democratic, the federal, the secular, and the Commonwealth. Although, as I've already said, I'm not going to talk about the secular now. The word Commonwealth, which we didn't get onto talking about, I'm going to take it to mean, and I think George, we had not a disagreement really with George, but there was a little, George said on a previous occasion that maybe I was using this term wrong, but I've taken the word to be more than just, because originally the Commonwealth meant the Republic. In 1649, they called the English Republic the Commonwealth, and that was the name that it had. But it also meant, in a sort of more popular sense, it meant a social republic where the welfare of people, it can be taken to mean another word. And I think when Ben uses the term Commonwealth, I have a little quote here from him so you get the sense of what he's saying. He says, this is what he says in 1993. He says, the time has come to refound our public institutions upon principles of the commonweal, democracy, and an internationalism more in tune with the needs of the 21st century. Well, that was in the 1990s, the 21st century. He sums up his proposal as the most important change in law and practice would be that every Briton would become a citizen of a democratic federal and secular commonwealth dedicated to the welfare of all, with fundamental human rights enshrined in a charter dealing with political, legal, social and economic dimensions. So he sees this as a very comprehensive change in our law and our constitution, and not just purely political, not just purely democratic, but about our social rights, rights as trade unionists, human rights and things like that. So it's quite a comprehensive thing that he's actually talking about. So I'm using the word Commonwealth, and this may be disputed, as just another term for a social republic. So on my next slide, I simply put down these two ideas. And again, this might be something we're going to have to debate or discuss, that a social republic can be thought of as being a democratic republic plus social institutions. Now, what we mean by social institutions and so on, that's another point we are going to have to look at what that phrase means. But just for the moment, a social republic is a democratic republic plus some other stuff. Okay, I use the term, some countries have already used the social monarchy as a constitutional monarchy plus social institutions. So if we had a constitutional monarchy and a welfare state, we'd have a social monarchy by the same thing. That's 1945, by the way, is really what we had then. We're going to talk about that on a future occasion, because I think it's quite important to understand the Labour Party and how the Labour Party works. So I'm really concentrating on this distinction between a democratic and a social republic. And one of the reference points for that, I'm just going to look at my notes a second, if I could, was an article, a really excellent article that Marie and George provided for me. Certainly Marie provided for me. It's a thesis. It's on the reading list. And it has a chapter on the Social Republic of 1871. It's called the Social Republic of 1871. And Marx saw the Paris Commune, set up in 1870-71, as a social republic, an example of a social republic. But when you dig into what's meant there, it's clear that Marx is talking to, he talks to a guy called Leo Frankel, who's a member of the First International, who was elected to the Commune and was in correspondence with Marx, and he sought Marx's advice. And he says to Marx, I have seen in the local proletariat the avant-garde of the Social Republican Army, So he asked Marx, your opinion regarding the social reforms that are to be brought into being would be of the highest value to our commission. So they set up a commission of the Commune to decide what social reforms they want. For we must before all else lay the foundation stone of the social republic. Now, it turns out that what Marx really looks at this is that this idea of a social republic being what the Paris Commune is, it doesn't really become a social republic, actually. Marx's real enthusiasm about it is because it's democratic. It never quite makes the transition to what Marx says. It's almost like the social republic was a slogan that they used, but not a description of where they got to. The most obvious exact thing was that they didn't, in the Paris Commune, take over the Bank of France. They were sitting there next to the Bank of France, a capitalist bank in the center of Paris there, and they didn't occupy it or take it over. So they didn't take those kind of measures. In fact, they never got there. They might have got there eventually, but they were overthrown before they did. So Marx's interest in the Paris Commune was about its democratic aspects. That was the key thing. It was really a democratic republic with the aspiration of becoming a social republic. Okay, so the chapter which Marie circulated is really well worth the read. And if we get that one chapter to send out, because it really sets out what happens in Paris and the basic principles, the basic democratic principles of the Paris Commune. So I thought my next point, therefore, would be to bring up a sort of typology to try and explain what was understood by a democratic republic. So I came up with this typology, and it's slightly different So I've slightly invented something here, so I'm going to try it out on people. But I'm going to talk about the monarchist state, what's understood by that idea. And then I'm going to talk about a presidential state. And you might call a presidential state a republic. But I might argue it's actually a bit like a monarchy with a president. You know, it hasn't got a king. You know, some people say America's kind of a presidential state, really, because although it's got the features of a monarchist state, but it's got a president and it calls itself a republic. But maybe presidential would be a better way of describing it. And then the third type is the Republican state or the Democratic Republic. So what I'm going to do is to say what I think is the key elements of the monarchist state and then contrast it. I won't really talk about the presidential state because we won't have time. But I'm going to take the monarchist state first of all, and then just talk about what we learned from the Paris Commune about a Republican or Democratic Republic. What was the ideas of that? So let me have a look a minute. And if we want to understand the monarchical state, now the monarchical state, okay, a monarchical state could be an autocratic one like Tsarist Russia or the Saudi Arabia, where you've got a king with autocratic powers, or it could be a liberal monarchy, a bit like we are, you know, where you've got a parliament. But the essential idea of any monarchical state, and I've divided it into two, so I'm following the master-servant idea. You know, the master of this system is the executive power, which we could call, and which Gerald Winstanley calls the kingly power. The kingly power is at the top. Power comes down to the subjects of the crown. So all these monarchical states have this top-down structure to them. Power coming from the top and coming and being devolved down. The state is the dominus, and the subjects of the crown are the service of that state. And so just to take that point a little bit more. So in other words, in a monarchical state, we've got a hierarchy, which is top down. We've got a bureaucracy, we've got secrecy. These are very important features of a monarchical state. So if we were going to look at our country, our state, we would certainly see hierarchy. We would see top-down power coming from the top. We would see bureaucracy, a massive, huge bureaucracy. And we would see the real importance of secrecy in how the state kind of manipulates us. They don't let us know hardly anything at all. And you can see that if you see something like the Hillsborough, you could look at many of the tragedies that have taken place. It takes some people 30 years to find out what the heck went on because it's all been kept secret and covered up. And that's one of the features of our monarchical top-down state. And again, it's just the power is coming down to the people or the popular classes. That includes the working class, the middle class, maybe other strata as well, are not ruling. They're not part of the governing classes. They are the ordinary people, as it were, there. And if we take that one little step further, that diagram, okay, just a further elaboration on that idea of a monarchical state. The executive is the power at the top in the hands of the king or an oligarchy. Then you have a standing army. Then you have the civil service. Then you have the judiciary in the prisons. Then you have the secret services. And then you may or may not have a parliament in this, where the people, the arrow's going up here, so the people are electing the parliament, but most of the power is top down, and we remain subjects of the crown. Now, Marx describes this in talking about the Paris Commune. If I'll just see how he describes it, and it's quite interesting. If I can just find the, where it is. Just bear with me a second. Yeah, Marx describes this kind of state. He says, this kind of state as a huge governmental parasite, he calls it, which strangles like a boa constrictor the real social body in the ubiquitous meshes of the standing army, a hierarchical bureaucracy, an obedient police, clergy, and a servile magistrature. That's what he's talking about, the state that has all those top-down features. Even the liberal version of it, the power is still there concentrated, it's still top-down, it's still dominus and serve us. It's still that idea of being oppressed by this state. And the point about Republican theories is it says it doesn't matter whether the slave master treats you well or treats you badly. Even if the slave master treats you well, and even if the state treats you well, it always has the power to turn on you if the circumstances require that to happen. So I wondered, therefore, if we're going to flip that over and think, well, in that case, what's a Republican state? In that case, how do we use that to say, well, what would be the features of a Republican state? So I put them, and this goes back to one of the little position papers we had, which we've got a little position paper on this, but in that position paper called Republican Democracy, first of all, this phrase is very important in Republican theory. A republic is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, this is Abraham Lincoln's famous phrase, but Marx also uses it, and it's used by a number of other people. Mazzini uses it. George Julian Harney uses it. I think it's John Linton, the English Republican, uses it. It's of course you can say, what does it mean, you know? But the principal idea is that for it to be a republic, the government of the people is going to be carried out by the people, and that implies the people being involved in their own government in the interests of the people. And the two obvious principles that you can get from that idea is that in a Republican state, sovereignty or power has to come from below. It has to be vested in the people. It has to go upwards, as it were, rather than downwards. It's the reverse of the monarchical state, that power has to be vested in the people. And it's in the law, in the constitution. You know, it's a legal thing as well. And then the other point is this principle of having people elected, accountable, and subjected to recall. Now, you could apply this to the Labour Party, by the way. Are people elected in the Labour Party? Are they accountable to anybody? And can we sack them if they don't? The struggle to get recall in the Labour Party is part of this kind of Republican battle already taking place. It's like the key thing between the Loyalists and Republicans is this subject to recall business. It's such a very important principle. Can we, if our MPs serve us badly, can we sack them or not? That's a very important point. And how long? And the other point, and in the Paris Commune, it's instantly recallable. By the way, you know, the principle I have there is we don't have to wait years and years before we get another chance to sack them. We can almost do it straight away. It's almost like you know, if we decide that we don't want them anymore, we'll elect somebody else. We'll not wait 5 years for Boris Johnson to screw up and then we can have another go, type of idea. You know, this idea that control, if it's going to be vested with the people, we must be able to not only elect them and call them to account, but also sack them. Tony Benn, this is the thing that Ben also talks, who can get rid of anybody and how can you get rid of them? Getting rid of them is as important as electing them. Yes. So that's a really kind of key thing. And from those principles, the next thing to ask about, what about the standing army? What about the state bureaucracy? These things that in the monarchical state dominate, the executive power of the king at the top, the kingly power, the standing army, right, which is not in people's control, and the state bureaucracy. And you could talk about the security services, the police, and other issues as well. So we might think of, therefore, a Republican state looking a little bit like this then, if we were thinking, what is our Republican democracy looking like in sort of principle? I've done it the other way around. In this model, the sovereign people are at the top because we are the masters. We're the masters. The arrows are going downwards. It's implying that we elect the parliament, but the parliament has to directly control the executive. The executive in our state, Boris Johnson and his gang sit almost independently of parliament. Today, when they were trying to reverse the 0.5 to 0.7%, parliament doesn't have any control. They've got to ask, you know, it's really quite difficult for anybody to control what they're doing. The executive controls our parliament, not the other way around. But in a democratic republic, if we'd elected a parliament, we would have that parliament would be able to sack the government. The executive power would be accountable to the people through this immediate channel. And also, we wouldn't want a standing army either, independently, because that's a danger. We'd want something more like a citizens' army. Maybe we'd have to have officers elected or something like that, so that that army cannot act against the people. I mean, the People's Army in China is meant to be a people's army. I mean, maybe we could talk about the Israeli army as well and things like that. But the People's Army in China is never going to oppress the people because it came from the people. That was the idea until Tiananmen Square, when, of course, it all turned out a bit differently. And then if we came over here to the civil service, for example, well, why wouldn't we treat the civil servants rather like any democratic organization where the rank and file civil servants who are providing these services, these public sector workers, weren't able to control their managers directly as well. So in other words, this would be about this line between people and the blue state begins to dissolve, because in a certain sense, as Marx says, this line, this two things, it doesn't work anymore. The people have kind of flooded over here, so that this distinction between people and state starts to melt a little bit. And that's why Marx said it's not a state in the proper sense of the word, not a state where one lot are in power and the other lot are just people. The people are more intimately involved in the actual governing of their society for themselves. And that implies a lot of local power, local democracy, and all those other things, so that people can be actually engaged, you know, not just having a national election, but engaged in people's councils and all the rest of it. Okay, so that's I'm not talking about presidential states, we've passed over that, but presidential states, I would simply say, are a bit like those monarchical ones, except they're something a bit different. They're more democratic than the monarchical ones, but they still have that power. Now, I'm going to move on quickly to the next point, keep an eye on the time here, which is centralized, because Ben is talking about a federal state. So I think there are two things that we were talking about in the group last week. A centralized republic is a republic with one law-making body, one parliament for the whole country. The one parliament makes the law for the whole country. So we elect to our National Assembly and the laws are made for the whole country. Whereas in a federal system, we have a central parliament, but we also have local or maybe national assemblies as well. So in Tony Benn's bill, there would be a parliament for Scotland, there'd be a parliament for Wales, and there's a parliament for England, plus there's an overarching kind of parliament for the whole Britain, the whole of Britain. In other words, there's one parliament where everybody sends people to, the central parliament, and then as we've got now. So the UK is not a federal state because we've got parliaments in Wales and Scotland, but we haven't got one in. We're just a halfway house somewhere on the road to something or other, just a kind of general mix up like we always do. So you don't get a semi mixed up kind of mess that we've got in our constitution. But consistently, that's what Ben's bill does propose, a federal structure with one central parliament and three subordinate parliaments, plus, of course, a lot of local democracy as well. But usually local councils can't make laws. Only these bodies can make laws. They can administer things and decide things. And the question then arises, which is more democratic? Is a federal system more democratic than a central system? Well, Marx argues that if you've just got one central state making laws for everybody, that is more democratic, because the working people want the same laws. They don't want to have, like, well, if you're a working class person living in Scotland, you've got sort of different rights there than you've got if you're living in England. So many laws would have to apply equally to everybody, and it's best if you have one central power. Those local assemblies, therefore, be a problem. Now, if you think of America as America's a good example, because you might say that Black people have equal rights in America in the central constitution decided in Washington. But Alabama might decide through its state legislature that it's not going to carry that out, because they'll say, well, in Alabama, we've got different things here. We want to have apartheid in Alabama. And that can exist and has existed in America. The federalism in America has allowed backward states to impose reactionary laws on all sorts of people. So Marx's argument is, and he actually says this, a federal republic, he says, is a step forward in America, but at some point it becomes a backward thing. It holds the development of the country, but it holds America back, is what he says. So the argument is the central state is better than a federal one. Which is the most democratic. But Engels and Marx argue that there are a couple of circumstances where federalism works better. And one of them is where you've got separate states coming together. The already existing parliaments, how do you unite them into one state? The United States was formed by 13 separate states forming themselves into one state. And so federalism was important to allow each state to keep their own parliaments. And we talked in our group about the European Union, which isn't a federal system, but it's not far off it. If the European Union became a state, federalism would be, the French people aren't going to give up their parliament, and the Germans aren't going to give up their parliament, even if we had a central parliament making central laws. So federalism might work in uniting Europe, and it did work in uniting America. And then the other example is where he says, if you've got a monarchical state, a federalism can enable you to make a transition to a federal republic would be more democratic than a monarchy. Now, if you think about that's exactly where Engels cites Britain as the example of this, and Ben's got it in his bill, because we're saying we've got a monarchy here. Maybe a federal republic would be a way forward, keeping the country together. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that argument today, by the way, but that's where the argument comes from, that Britain with a monarchy becoming a federal republic could be seen as a step forward in democratic terms, even if we think one parliament would be a better system overall. So that's the argument there. So that's why Ben has got federalism in his model of his republic. I've nearly finished now, comrades. I will just two more little slides and then we'll stop and open it up. So, okay, two more slides. The last one I wanted to say was the idea of the social republic, which I said early on was a very democratic republic like the Paris Commune plus some other stuff. Okay, now what the other stuff will be for working class people to decide on the day what they want, obviously. So we can't say if it'll have more of this and less of that, or more of that and less of this, or whatever. But it would include, in my opinion, recognition of the rights of the working class people in the Constitution. So, for example, the right to join a trade union, the right to strike, this would be law of the land. It would recognize the working class exists and it's an important class in our society. The recognition of the welfare of working people, like, for example, education, health, NHS, public housing, all sorts of things like that, along those lines, unemployment benefits, all the rights that we sort of, we think about and are aware of. And not just the ones we got already, by the way, but they would be, in a democratic society, we'd be extending them. And then I think the last point in this social republic would imply some kind of public ownership. Again, not necessarily the abolition of capitalism or anything like that, not total public ownership, but certainly a mixed economy, certainly a mix of public and private things would be possible. But whether the people decide we want 90% public and 10% private or 50-50, that's something that people would have to decide. We don't have to say, oh, it'll be 50-50 or 90-10 or anything like that. We don't have to say that. We can have a view of socialists, of course. So in a way, it's a very democratic state where sovereignty comes from below, where the people can exercise their power over all the state institutions and be involved in their self-government, government by the people, for the people, of the people, with all these social rights and social institutions that we might have already. Which brings me back to my last slide, is just to say, well, that's what Tony Benn was, there's we get back to Tony Benn, that's what he was talking about in his 1991. Not exactly what I've said, by the way, because I'm doing like a critical look at it, but the essential idea that what Ben was promoting, putting before us, was the idea of a democratic federal secular social republic or commonwealth. And I think that's where we as left, I'd say we as Left Labour Alliance, we as the Republican Labour Group should be starting to campaign for something like that in the Labour Party. The Republican wing of the Labour Party has got to become exactly that. So that leads me to, I think, the end. I think we got the end. We got the end. There we are. The end. That's it.
The end.
The end. Last slide goes. It's the end. You can all go. Okay. Thank you, comrades. Okay, so I let's open it up for some discussion, hopefully, and I will just get rid of this. Stop the sharing.
Yes, I think
That's
Paul
gone.
has had his hand up for absolutely ages, but can I just say, could I vote for that, please? I think that sounds like last diagram that you had was marvelous. And can we please have it, and can we please vote for it? Sounds amazing. Anyway, Paul's had his hand up for absolutely ages. Please go ahead, Paul.
I just want to say on one of the slides where it was the Republican state, it got the one section on there. You got elected managers, and I thought that, well, despite my my personal views around police and crime commissioners, I don't really agree with them, but when talking of elected managers in this context, if the turnout was good, then police and crime commissioners could perhaps be an example of those elected managers, as it were. Obviously, this is dealing directly with the police because they control the budget and that sort of thing. And that's suddenly what I thought about, although it's much more, it's lower down in the chain, as it were, because obviously each area is governed by different police force. But yeah, that's what I suddenly thought of when I saw that little section on that slide. Thanks.
Yes, I think that's quite a good point. And also they're elected every 2 years, I believe, aren't they, Paul? So you aren't stuck with them forever.
Elected after what, sorry?
I think they're elected every 2 years, aren't they? The police and crime commissioners and mayors. Is it every 2 years?
Oh, I thought it was every 4 years. Like,
oh, maybe I'm wrong then. Okay, yeah, I thought it was every 2 years.
I could
Anyway.
be wrong. Yeah.
No, you're probably right, Paul. Okay, Mari, over to you. You had your hand up next.
Yes, funny enough, I was going to home in on the same topic. So in the slide on the Republican state, citizens' army, parliament controls the executive and the elected managers. So this and what is also specified for the social republic, where the public ownership and mixed economy, I think what this a whole new dimension to the debate is coming up, because obviously, but managers, I did not think just of the police and police people. I thought of the managers in the companies, and this won't happen. They won't be elected unless the citizens have taken over the points of production and are electing the managers. This is the way I understood this. And I think that therefore the citizens will have to be armed, and this debate needs to link up with the resistance, the implacable resistance one finds in the way to all of these ideas. Then I connect this with the social republic and the public ownership, and people will decide how much the economy will be mixed. I don't think it will be quite like this. I think that the mass of the working population is going to find itself having to compose, having to accept how much they managed through their being armed to impose the right to decide. And so it's not going to be a choice. It's going to be the best thing that we can do in front of implacable opposition. Yeah, this is what I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Marie. Russell had his hand up next. Russell, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to take up the, I think it's related to what the last two people said, which is the question of a people's army, which in some senses is more complex than just having a people's army. The idea of while electing one's officers, for example, is right. I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact, not only within the military, but also within the organization of production, technically or technologically, things have developed. So you can't just say we'll elect officers or we'll elect managers. There also has to be some sort of selection process as to who is exactly qualified. So for instance, within the military, you can't just elect anybody to be an officer. And even if we go back to Trotsky in his building of the Red Army, and in his, if people look at his works, people don't realize that Trotsky was also a military theorist and strategist of some repute in his own right. And he had a lot of arguments and disagreements about how you should actually run a what one must assume is a people's army. And then, sorry, actually more importantly, that's a slightly a different issue, but we also have to reckon with the fact that many militaries, many bourgeois republics or sort of capitalist societies have a military which is based on conscription, which is a form of the people's army. Everybody has to, certainly males reach a certain age, they have to serve in the military. Whereas in the question of people raise the question of Israel, there are a lot of contradictions and paradoxes here, because you could argue that the Israeli society has a more kind of democratic army where both men and women are conscripted into the army, and they in that army there's a far greater level of informality between the rank and file and the officers than in many other armies. But I suppose I'll just finish off by pointing out that it's very often overlooked when America picked its fight with Venezuela and tried to overthrow the government of Venezuela. Not that it stopped trying, but I think it's realized it can't do it. And it kept on speaking about, we need to get the army, somehow we need to get the army to join this fake president Guaido, and they will overthrow the government. But what's overlooked is that Venezuela has a people's militia, which could be considered a people's army, which consists of about 3 million people under arms. And the Venezuelan army, the formal Venezuelan army, itself is based on conscription, but many of the personnel, and I think the officer corps, are actually trained in Cuba, and it's not just an ordinary army that can be split off from from the state, since they comprise part of the state. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Larry, you were the next hand up.
Very much. Thank you, Carol. Yeah, whilst this debate's been going on about, and we use the army as an elected agent, the same can apply to shop stewards and local councillors. The question seems to rise often with myself is that working people basically want good leadership, but without responsibility falling upon themselves. And there lies the problem, is that if we're going to achieve a republic, we have to educate the leadership and accountability of people within our community. I mean, I live in a small community of 1,000 people, and less than 1% are even interested in becoming a councillor or any other organised. We've got a number of organisations, but within that 1%, all those people, the people in that 1% are either committee members, officers of all the organisations within our community. You know, people are quite happy to have the community and have people run it for them, but they don't want to do it themselves. And this is because I've had this discussion with in our community. We've got a high percentage of ex-army personnel, and when I've raised the issue of electing officers and you know, the people through the ranks, they laugh. They think it's absolutely ridiculous. It hasn't occurred to them that they should elect somebody to represent them within their own army. So it's difficult to come to terms of recognising that. I understand the need for it, the same as I understand the need for electing shop stewards, but not everybody wants to be a shop steward.
No, that's a really interesting point you're making there, Larry. Do you think this is just thoughts on what you said? Do you think this all started with Thatcher and the breakdown of community and the way that people actually feel quite powerless today? They you know, I think there was a much greater sense of community, say, in the 60s and 70s, and that was broken down by Thatcher. I mean, she said, didn't she, there is no such thing as society, because she wanted to break down those community bonds. Do you think that's a reason for that now, or do you think it's a general apathy amongst people, or is it something that's been, you know, getting worse and worse over recent years?
I think if you're directing it back to me, is that I think that the Thatcher period, I think that one was to undermine the industrial organisations, i.e. trade unions, but at the same time is that and I look at the docks as a prime example, is that the land that they were standing on, where they worked, was more valuable to them than anything else. And and this is where the Tories are, how can I say, more equipped. They think long term in their capitalist aspirations. They were probably thinking, you know, the London dock development was probably thought about long before the trade unions ever thought that they would be decimated in the dock areas and that the community disseminated to Crawley New Towns and all those other places that they sent them to, and undermine the trade union structures. So I think that some of it goes beyond Thatcher, obviously. You know, I think that people have never really wanted to take up responsibilities, other than people that are designated self-proclaimed leaders. I think he's probably, you know, like Keir Hardie and people like that. They saw themselves as leaders, whereas a lot of working people don't. They just want somebody else to do it for them.
Okay, interesting. There's Paul and Jennifer, but Jennifer hasn't spoken before, Paul. So I'm going to go to Jennifer first because she hasn't spoken yet. Over to you, Jennifer.
Hello, thank you, Carol. I thought Larry's point and his description of the situation he's in his community is very interesting. And I think we have to look at education, don't we? I mean, increasingly under progressive Tory and Labour governments, education has been something that you passively receive. And the control over the curriculum has become tighter and tighter and tighter. The discretion for teachers to explore different areas has been drastically reduced. And I mean, the latest manifestation of that is that they are not allowed to talk about, to use any anti-capitalist materials. I mean, how dictatorial is that? So how could we possibly expect to have young people coming out of schools and colleges willing to take up responsibility and equipped to take up responsibility if they have never been encouraged to take even responsibility for their own learning, let alone working in a collegial way in their schools and colleges and learning to take responsibility? I mean, actually, kids in primary schools take more responsibility for themselves and their fellow pupils and the running of the school than in secondary schools and in universities. Thank you.
Excellent points, absolutely excellent points there, Jennifer. Totally agree with you. Right, Paul, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to come on the point that you made, Carol, about did all this stuff start with Thatcher? And I once said in another meeting, I think it was a meeting in a group called Another England, which me and Steve and a few others here are also part of, where I argued that actually, you know, one member made the point that, you know, a lot of big clubs and stuff that people used to go to, it's sort of dwindled over the years. And I said that I thought that some of that may well go back to all the way back to the invention of the television. Because as people got gradually have more hours in the day and a few more hours of free time, you know, all they had was a radio and a newspaper. So what do you do with the time? And of course, years ago, people go to social clubs or whatever. But now with the TV, you don't necessarily have to do that. But I think Jennifer made a good point about education. But about education, I mean, I've once said that if the and I'm sure we've all said it at some point, that if the world was run by children, we'd be in a much better place. I think it sounds rather cynical, but there does seem to be a point where once you become a certain age, an adult, it's almost like the vast majority lose interest in the political events going on around, and they don't understand the connections that has on their lives. And so it's all very sort of mixed up, but yes, I think, I mean, Larry made the point about the industries where people used to work. And of course, now so much of our land is actually corporate land. It's not, you know, there's not common land anymore as such. It's so much of it is corporate owned. So technically you can't even gather there, even if you're just sitting quietly with a few friends. You can't do that. Somebody might come along and tell you to move off, you know, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there's a number of things happening in that respect. But yes, unfortunately for people like us that take a natural interest in politics, we are a minority breed, and I'm not real. I think sadly people only start to get involved these days when something affects them. and then it sort of wakes them up. And I hope you don't mind me plugging, but if you're not in any employment these days, you can join the Unite community, which I'm now a new member of. And I think all progressives, if you're not in the union and you're not in employment, you can still join the union now. So that's one way that you can be involved, because talking about education, often unions these days will help with the funding of education, or they will bring people in to educate on various subjects. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, good points. Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm going to play a bit devil's advocate here, if I may, Steve. This, you know, the pattern, the model that you put forward at the end of your talk, I thought was absolutely marvelous. But we come back to that old saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think we've got to be really careful about the checks and balances we put in place to the checks and balances you put in place to make sure that the people at the top then don't actually take the power unto themselves. So I'd love to know how I know you're saying that you got the power of recall. How would that work? How would you make sure that we don't get a Chairman Mao or a Stalin who then runs autocratically and you're in just as bad a position as you were before?
I mean, can I just say, Carol, if there's any, I will come back and try to answer your point and any other points that comrades have raised. If there's, are we getting to that point in the where I'm going to do that? Shall I, rather than?
I haven't got any more hands up.
Got
now,
no more
Steve.
hands on. Shall I come back and I'll answer that one as well, Carol, in the course of what I'm going to say. So, comrades have raised some key points, some slightly misunderstanding. So. And it was in my PowerPoint, when I put the word elected managers in there, what I really meant was in the civil, I was really referring only to the state. So I was referring to the civil service. So the idea, I guess, was that in the Department of Education, rank and file civil servants would be able to elect there, to keep control of what was going on in the Department of Education. The rank and file workers would be able to elect their managers. And therefore there would be by a recallable system, which would mean that they would never gain power above the civil. They would always be in touch with the knowledge of the whole of the civil service. So this is purely about the state. It isn't saying anything about capitalist companies, although I do think by extension you'd want to add democratic rights into businesses. Even if they didn't go into public ownership, you'd want to extend democracy in the workplace, absolutely. And that would be, democracy wouldn't stay at the state. But when I put the word elected managers, that's just my poor PowerPoint that should have said that in the civil.
Sorry, Steve. Sorry, I've muted you, Steve. Can you unmute? Sorry.
Here we go. Sorry, I was just meaning to say in the armed forces, and of course I haven't talked about the police or there's other bodies as well, but they're all, you know, the principle was basically, the idea is that you break down the dividing line between the people working in the state and the rest of the population, you know, which is the characteristic of the monarchical state, that it is power over people, power above people, power coming down from the top. And you're reversing that by making a democratic state where power comes from below. And how do we make sure that the civil service aren't plotting against us? Then you've got to be accountable to where they work. And it's the same in the idea of the People's Army. Russell made some good points about the People's Army. This is not a wild idea. It sounds a bit wild, the People's Army, you know, the conscription, of course, is when people are involved in there. But if you've got a conscripted army or a People's Army, or these actual practical examples that exist today, you know, like of conscripted armies, if they've got professional officers who are directly answerable to a monarchical kind of state, then being people's conscripted armies, that conscripted army will do what their officers tell them to do. You know, they'll just be like a standing army, except that you've got a load of other people in it as well, who are ordinary citizens who put on the uniform but still behaving like any other dictatorial army. And it's worth remembering that the New Model Army in 1649, they elected their agitators. They elected like their shop stewards. The problem was that the Parliament couldn't control the New Model Army because the rank and file soldiers elected their representatives who met with the grandees, you know, who were still the old style officers. And the old style officers couldn't control the army because of the strength of the rank and file democracy in the New Model Army. And that's 300 years ago they were doing that, you know. So if they could do it 300 years ago, have shop stewards in the army, well, it's not beyond the wit to have that same idea, that soldiers. And the argument is that a group of soldiers aren't stupid. They're not going to elect some idiot to be their leader who's going to lead them into battle and have them all killed. The soldiers are going to know what the people around them are like, and they're going to go, yeah, Larry's a good bloke. We've worked with him, and we'll follow him. Or Russell's shown the sort of person he is, or Jennifer has, we'll elect her to be our officer, or whatever it is. And the people who are best placed to choose good officers are the people who live and die in those armies, you know. And so democracy in the army, which might seem very, very radical, goes back to the 17th century and beyond. So I do think, yes, we have to talk about, we don't have to make it sound ultra left, by the way, you know, like the Red Army or something. It's just the idea that you can have a conscripted army, you can have a citizens' army. There is nothing lunatic. It's just that it has to be under the control of the people so that it cannot be used by a government to crush the people's freedom. It's impossible for it to do that because the army is part of the people. It's not separate from the people. That's the idea, that the army is not in the state part and we're in the people part. The dividing line between the people and the state is broken down because we flood into the army and the army comes, and then we come back to Civvy Street and all the rest of it. And then Larry's point is also a very, very important point, and it goes into the question of culture and education, which Jennifer also brought up, and I think that was very, very important. You know, how do we get our fellow citizens to actually want to be? How do we get them to be shop stewards even? How do we get them to do all these things? And you probably have to say that we need education and a culture that encourages it. We have an education system and a culture system in this country that says, don't bother, don't do these things. It's not your job. The idea of what we talked about civic republicanism is the idea that you are meant to. It's your duty to contribute to society by being involved. We don't have that culture. We have the culture, which Larry refers to, is that we want somebody else to do it because we're in that kind of state where we leave it up to other people. We leave it up to the state to do these things. It's not your job. It's somebody else's job to do it. So I think that's deeply embedded in our culture. And Larry gives the examples of what it's like in his local community to try to encourage people. If you went to America, by the way, which has a more Republican culture, you probably get a better attitude amongst ordinary American citizens out in the sticks to be involved in their local communities. It's probably a very different attitude because they are taught that, you know, we the people are in charge of this thing, you know what I mean? So if you have that culture, we the people are in charge of stuff, then you think it's your idea. So education and culture and values, getting those values of participation is part of a kind of revolution in attitudes and values. It's not just constitution we need to change, but it's people's attitudes towards the state, to think the state is not something out there that they're doing to us. It's something that we control for ourselves. So I agree with those points. We have to have a revolution in our attitudes and culture and our education system. We have to promote, as Jennifer said, these values to young children, to the next generation and so on. So and I think Jennifer made the point that probably young children probably participate more in school life, I'm right in thinking this, than maybe secondary school kids or university. They've kind of got a different attitude going on in schools. And then my last point is Carol's point. I think, how can we ensure that a dictatorship doesn't arrive in our republic? And the answer is, there is no absolute guarantee of that, as there is of anything. But the only thing we can do is have laws and culture and values and attitudes and the ability to participate that give us the power to be able to keep these things in check, as opposed to let them run away with us. You know, we can't stop a counter revolution happening. We can't stop the old order restoring itself. But the more, how can we stop fascism? Some people say, well, the people have to be vigilant about this. People have to understand the danger of fascism, have to know what fascism is, and then there's more chance that we can stop it. So I think there's not an absolute answer to keeping us safe, Carol, but there are things that we can do. And if we allow power to concentrate at the top, or we allow power to stay at the top, which is what it is in our country, we're all faced with the danger. We have a liberal constitutional monarchy, but the power at the top could be used by Boris Johnson to become something easily, without our constitution, to easily become something much more authoritarian. And we can see that trend always happening. We don't have those checks and balances in our own system. That's definitely missing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there, Steve. Yeah, absolutely right. So I think from what everyone's saying, it really, education is the key, isn't it? Yeah. Education is so important here.
Education and revolution. I mean, we have to change the system and build the education around. I mean, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? We have to be educating, but actually, until we change the power structures, the education won't really go very far. It's the struggle, as Marie said in the chat line. It's the struggle, the Republican struggle of the working class.
Absolutely. I've got one hand up, and that's Russell. Russell, are you there?
Just yeah, I just wanted to say the paradox or irony of liberal democracy is it is liberal democracy that in my view that is responsible for the de-education of a country's citizenry, and it essentially disempowers people and makes them politically illiterate, because in a liberal democracy, ironically, people think is the most sophisticated form of democracy there is, because you're allowed every 5 years to go into a booth and cast your vote, and that's it. So in a way, I think it's important. I mean, as Steve concluded with, it's important to develop a critique of liberal democracy as a formal instrument or formal mechanism for allowing people to express their political preferences, because until that is achieved, and of course pivotal to that is a kind of education, but a mass education. I mean, we don't control, the left has very little control over the media, the instruments of mass communication, which constantly push this myth that liberal democracy is the most advanced form of allowing people to express their political preferences. So it boils down to a power struggle, a conflict between those who want who see democracy as something more than just going into a booth and casting a vote every 5 years or whatever.
Can I just respond to that point, because I want to do so that we could do just to get the essence of what I'm saying. So liberal democracy is the form that a monarchical state, the real point about what I'm saying is there's this monarchical state with which power comes from the top down, which is hiding behind the mask of liberal democracy. So if we're talking about liberal democracy, it sounds more democratic. That if we don't see that behind that is this monarchical state structure, that's what we have to see, in which power is concentrated at the top in the hands of the kingly power of the executive. So we can use the term liberal democracy. I'm not disagreeing with that, but I just want to say that what I'm trying to get over here is not just to say liberal democracy, but to say behind that is this monarchical power structure, which goes right the way back for the executive power, independently of the parliament even, and out of our control. And that's the really part of our critique. It's not that we don't think liberal democracy is not working very well, it's that behind it is a power structure which is undemocratic, bureaucratic and secretive, you know, was the points I was making.
Yeah, Mari had a hand up next. Mari?
Yes, I expect we don't have much time, but I would
No,
like
we are. Yes, we're up to. I was about to say we've gone past the 2 hours now. So,
yeah. So I will be very brief. I think it's been an important discussion. That the conclusion that just now Russell drew a conclusion. Well, we don't control the press. There is no. How can we access the people? Well, we can't unless we start. I think we should raise this in the Labour Party. We need a press. A Labour press, not something which is of a group which is associated with Labour, but a press which is in and from the trade unions and the Labour left. And to come back to what, and I think the LLA has a duty in this. And to come back to what Steve said, yes, the important thing, I think he told us once, you have got all this rubbish in the loft, but they are not just in the loft. They are in fact in the political space. The monarchist structure is in our political space and is preventing us from developing our own structures. So it is not like we have to clear the attic, it's that we have to clear the structures which they have built in society, through which they are holding us prisoners. Yeah, that's, thank you.
thanks, Marie.
Thanks, Marie.
Well said.
We got some Steve, that does.
We used to have the Daily Herald, I believe, which years ago was owned by the TUC, I believe.
Yeah.
But the trouble was that was bought by the Sun.
I mean, can I just make a point on that, but just relevant to this, which is there's a difference between a socialist press, which we need to put forward socialist ideas, but the idea of a Republican press, that is to say, I don't mean advocating republicanism, but i.e. a press based on the idea of citizenship and citizen activism and reporting to people that people can trust, not because it's peddling socialism necessarily, but because it is actually seen to be the citizens can hear the truth. That's the kind of press we need as well. We need the socialist press, but we need a citizens press. And we never discussed press in this, but you could incorporate this into this whole story actually, which I didn't do, but it's, you know, I think it is. I'm glad that's come up. I'm glad that's come up as well. That's part of our story too. The press is a big problem, but a citizens press is not a mad idea. But you get that idea that people, or ordinary people, are doing articles and doing this and doing that and taking photographs and, you know, using the media and all those other things. There is a kind of citizens kind of press movement that's looking for truth and honesty and all those things that the capitalist press isn't doing. So I think we should promote that idea as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're now nearly 10 minutes past the 2 hours, so I have no more hands up, Steve. So I leave it to you to draw things to a close.
I think we've done it. I think we've drawn it. I think comrades have raised some great points. I'd like to think we've had a good discussion, and we've gone around. I think we've gone around the things. I will either I will write up my notes, by the way, so that I could possibly send them around to people. That might be okay if you can just have a look, because obviously we've made so many points in this thing. But yeah. Okay, and the next internal group meeting that we have, just to say this, obviously we'll talk about breakout groups and other stuff there as well. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks, comrades, for coming.